Today I'm joined by Rebecca Cassidy. Rebecca Cassidy is a Professor of Anthropology at Goldsmiths University, and she's the author of a new book. It's called Vicious Games, Capitalism and Gambling. What was it that got you interested into gambling as a field of study?
I came to gambling through horse racing, and my first ambition was to be a journalist on the Racing Post, which is like the UK's it was a daily newspaper for people who went racing. And so after I graduated, I went on the British Horse Racing Authority graduate trainee scheme, and my work placement was on the Racing Post. So I went off to Canary Wharf to work there, and that was quite an experience. Pretty much a kind of all-male press room environment where people were going off daily to racing and stuff like that. It was brilliant. I mean, I loved it. So I kind of, that was my segue from horse racing into gambling. And I'd been part of horse racing as part of my PhD. So when I graduated, I was supposed to go to Albania to do some field work there, and they had that terrible civil unrest, civil war really, after their terrible pyramid scheme and economic collapse and so on. So I wasn't allowed to go there. So I stayed in Cambridge and worked as a security guard. When we were like working night shifts all through the night, and I was the control, so I was manning the radio during the night, checking everyone was awake every hour, and obviously they weren't. And in the morning, everyone would just get in their security vans and drive up to Newmarket to watch the horses training. So I started going with them, and I wrote to my supervisor, Janet Carston in Edinburgh, and just said, I don't really want to go to Albania. I'd really like to stay here and work on horse racing in Newmarket. So that's what I did my PhD on. And I've always been interested in horses specifically. I was one of those really annoying brats who just wants to be with horses at any cost, whose parents despair. So it was really from horses to horse racing for my PhD. And then after my PhD, I went and worked on the Racing Post for a very brief period as like an apprenticeship. And then after that, I kind of moved from horse racing into gambling. That's always really kind of been, I think, a helpful perspective for me, because I didn't come into gambling from a sort of a psychological perspective or anything like that. I always came at it as an anthropologist, and that's sort of significant for maybe reasons we might talk about.
Yeah, we'll get into that. What do you think anthropology can tell us about gambling?
Well, I think anthropology can tell us a lot about everything, needless to say. I'm a bit of a celebrant of anthropology. And the particular value to gambling is that, gambling has a lot of very distinctive properties in terms of being a system of redistribution, working on randomness, chance, uncertainty, risk, all of those sorts of central elements of the politics of distribution, if you like. And so gambling has this sort of transformatory property that I think is very exciting for anthropologists. And it's also, been part of many different societies. So you can see how it operates differently in different places and times and different contexts. And something like that is really useful to anthropology, because what it does is shows that what we think and do about it now is rather arbitrary, because you can do things completely differently as they do in this place or time. And I'm thinking sort of, I suppose, about the early chapter in Vicious Games, where I'm talking about how raffles operate in local communities to redistribute wealth. And it's sort of quite similar to the way that hunters and gatherers have used gambling to kind of minimize inequality. Whereas obviously what commercial gambling does, operating as it does through a system of, broadly a capitalist system, is to pool resources in certain locations, quite predictable locations, and to perhaps take a process which can be used to diminish inequality and use it to protect inequality. So yeah, that's why I think gambling, there's a lot that anthropologists can say about gambling. I think also, I don't know about you, but I think that the contexts where gambling takes place are incredibly rich and interesting in themselves. So betting shops just are really quite, socially dense and yeah, fascinating places with their own dynamics, their own etiquette, and their own way of, you have to know how to move through the world in order to become part of a betting shop milieu, if you like. So yeah, I enjoy those sorts of places. I enjoy race courses. I'm not that keen on casinos. I find them more difficult to kind of immerse myself into somehow. And I think that is because of the link with horse racing. So a lot of the people I work with don't count betting as gambling. Do you see what I mean? And in fact, they're kind of opposite, because betting suggests that you have some sort of knowledge on which to base your speculation, whereas gambling is kind of abandoning yourself and abandoning rational judgment, and kind of, so they have very, again, gambling is is just such a broad term. It encompasses all these different practices that share various elements, but are also in some cases importantly different. And so for an anthropologist, that's kind of something you look at and you just go, yeah, that's going to help me better understand this group of people and what's important to them. So that's probably, apart from the personal side of it, which came definitely from horses via horse racing, I think that's why it's important. And actually, finally, I think why it's become important to me lately is because of social justice. So I think I found it, I used to think I could just do ethnographic studies of betting environments just because that was intrinsically interesting. And then I started to think actually, that these sorts of extractive industries have an impact on people's lives, and that I have to be more responsible in the way that I write and think about gambling, frankly, because the government profits from gambling, and the corporations that profit from gambling also benefit from the way that the government presents and represents gambling. So I think there's a kind of contemporary question here about social justice and transparency and honesty and integrity that became more interesting to me as I as I grew older and more critical, I think.
I'm not well acquainted with the anthropological literature on gambling. I know that Clifford Geertz wrote about the Balinese cockfight quite famously. Yeah, but is this quite a new area of study, and are you a leading pioneer, would you say?
Oh gosh, I'm one of a few people who think it's important. I think Anthony Pickles, also of Cambridge, has written a really fascinating book about gambling in Melanesia recently. Fiona Nicol in Australia has written a really important book about sort of everyday gambling. Many people have written important things. I suppose the closest to mine is Natasha Schull, the anthropologist of Las Vegas, who is just an incredibly gifted field worker and analyst. So I would say I would count her as definitely as a pioneer in anthropology, and someone who I would, whose work I would hope to be counted among, and there are many other people. So I think there's been a kind of long tradition of studying gambling in anthropology that's sort of fairly low key, and Geertz is part of that, but obviously he was using gambling to illustrate his broader social theory and also important points about field work, as we know. But I think there has always been a kind of interest in gambling. But I think there's been a reluctance for people to make it their central focus, because it's kind of, it's not necessarily been a kind of sexy topic in the past. And I think, I think that's changing a little bit as we think more in anthropology about uncertainty, risk and value, because it does touch on many of those issues. So I think and I hope that gambling is going to become more important going forward. I think the other problem about it is that, you know, it's, when people start working on gambling, there is a temptation, if you like, to, or perhaps people feel a sense of responsibility, as I do, to move towards a public health perspective, away from an anthropological perspective. You know, there's money for funding, and there's you know, social capital as well in moving in that direction. But it becomes, as far as I'm concerned, and I've argued this for a long time, and you know, people are quite welcome to continue to ignore me. You know, I feel as though that is a set of investigations where the answers are already thought to be known, and it's just a sort of working back from them, and it's about responsible gambling and so on. And I don't enjoy that kind of work, and that's why I always wanted to be an anthropologist who works on gambling rather than a gambling researcher. Yeah, so that sort of distancing, I think, will continue in anthropology, I hope, anyway.
And it's a really basic question, but what is gambling and where do we draw the line?
Well, you know, I'm not a big line drawer myself, so you know, the more the merrier. I think where it's useful or productive to make connections is between, obviously, gambling and other forms of finance, and you can, you know, at the moment I'm working with a really talented student on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and so on. So I think there's lots of fields, and lots of existing fields, but also some emerging fields where gambling is kind of broadening in its reach. I mean, so that's exciting to me. I think wherever something is put at risk on the basis of something, the outcome of which is uncertain, I think you can grab that and say, you know, I can make connections with that as some form of gambling. What becomes interesting, of course, as an anthropologist is how states and others choose to define gambling. And that is to include some of the things they want you to do and exclude some of the things that they're not sure about. So famously in Japan, you know, gambling was illegal, but they had the highest, I think they still have actually, the highest number of machines, gambling machines of anywhere in the world. And that's pachinko. But it doesn't count as gambling because although you play your hideous, loud, awful, blaring pachinko machine in one place, when you win, if you win, you know, obviously most people lose. If you win, you have to take your winnings, your tray of ball bearings, convert them into a ticket, and then you have to go next door or down the road to get your prize. So in making a definition of gambling a place where, as in a casino, you play your game, you take your risk, you cash in your chips all in the same building, the definition of gambling excludes pachinko because you get your prize somewhere else. Of course, it's still gambling, but it wasn't in the interest of the Japanese state to describe it as such. So yeah, that's where perhaps my interest lies, in definitions, not in so much as excluding things, but in the sort of motivations for people to treat different kinds of risk-taking differently.
And an interesting phrase that you use is the black box of the gambling industry. Now, what do you mean by that?
Oh, well, it's just that, you know, from the time, well, you know this, Ryan, that, you know, if you know something and not many other people know it, then that has value. So from the time that I was, excited and fortunate at the time enough to work on the Racing Post, I knew the value of information, tips and, inside knowledge, as we called it then. In fact, actually, most of it was pretty useless because everyone thought they knew something in the paper. But so the whole of the gambling industry is, I would say, secretive and interested in preserving their advantage over others. They also have quite a distinctive sort of sector where there are a few really massive corporations, as you know, and they do things, they preserve their own secrets, basically, in order to preserve their place in the market. And some of their practices, which I think I've described in the book, they may be legal, but they are also, if you expose them, they may not be moral always. So things like pursuing people to be VIPs, encouraging people to bet may not always be in those people's interests, shall we say. So, and the black box of gambling is just like, most industries. And this is why anthropology is very difficult, as well as being useful. People didn't really want me to write about the potentially exploitative practices in the gambling industry and their dire consequences. They wanted me to write about how I remember being encouraged to write about certain things by people in the industry. Oh, it's really sociable, isn't it great for society? We're taking care of each other and so on. So the black box of the gambling industry is the industry behind closed doors at their conferences, in their everyday interactions, like when I spent time at the headquarters of a bookies, it helps to know how people imagined the world to work, in their everyday lives. And that's what anthropology is really good at. It makes no sense to say bookmakers are all greedy, terrible people. And therefore, because that suggests that they'll always be, they would be exploiting people regardless. It makes much more sense to say, how did we get to this situation where gambling is regarded as the same as any other industry, any other leisure industry, going to the cinema, selling someone a pair of shoes, whatever it is. So, and if you think of all people who are involved in the gambling industry as somehow wicked, then it places them beyond analysis, and you can't, there's nowhere to go with that. You just say, well, you may as well forget about it then. But if you actually understand that they, in their view of the world and the view of many other people working in, businesses where there are shareholders, quarterly reports, and so on. The idea of if you can get it, whatever you can get out of other people, that is legitimate because they want it. Okay, that kind of idea, and then buyer beware. That kind of idea. It's not uncommon, and it's really acute, or it's really distinctive in the gambling industry, which is more fool them. If I can get money from him, he's a mug, and it's his fault, he's greedy or whatever. And frankly, it's also based on a kind of view of humanity that is very distinctive and very sort of historically recent, which is that everyone's out for themselves, and that's how you explain that is human nature. Well, having done some anthropology yourself, that most of the people who've ever lived in world historical terms did not think in those ways. They were thinking about sharing, and they were hunters and gatherers and so on. So, in living in much smaller societies, of course. So that kind of that's sort of why I think it's important to understand the industry, not just the people who consume gambling, where much of the research focuses, but actually the people who produce it and what they think they're doing.
I think what's really interesting, you talk about the shift that takes place in the 1990s. So we go from a position where it's not just toleration, but it's kind of encouragement of gambling in many ways. So what occurs in those years?
Well, I mean, politically, as you know, it's a time of individualism and the idea that improvement comes from entrepreneurial activities and so on. So it's partly that, it's the rise of shareholder society and privatization and all those sorts of things. And with that came in gambling an idea that people should have the choice to spend their money as they please. So before then, gambling was kind of something that was tolerated, but to be done basically out of sight. And after that point, when they had various reviews culminating in the Gambling Act, it was a completely different view of gambling. It was the stigma was supposedly removed from gambling. So you could advertise gambling, you could encourage people to gamble in a way that you hadn't been able to do before. And that was not really based on demand from people for more gambling. In fact, I think I put in some stats about it. People didn't really want it, but it fitted with the ideology of the time. And of course, the industry were more than happy to provide it. So you have this massive shift in the place of gambling. It moves from being a potential source of crime to being a source of, economic income, a legitimate industry. And yeah, the people who you've just mentioned, described in that chapter, are bookmakers who were involved in that change, who were actually quite surprised by the extent to which they were listened to by the government of the day, helped by free market think tanks and lawyers who were prepared to make really clever arguments about, taking the politics out of gambling, as they called it. Of course, I just think that's putting a different kind of politics into gambling, but that's...
And how do you think we compare to other countries in terms of prevention measures and our attitudes towards gambling?
Well, we have the most permissive market for gambling in the world, I would say, for legal, regulated gambling. So in that, I think we lead the way. We're known within the industry as the most sort of what would they call it, progressive regime, perhaps. But I think, and so in lots of other places, gambling, particularly online, is still illegal. So in most of the largest markets like China and India, it takes place hugely but illegally. So I think what makes us distinctive, perhaps alongside Australia and America, is the willingness of the state to embrace gambling as a source of income and as a legitimate industry. And where that comes from is partly because we have such a long history of regulated gambling of various kinds. So we perhaps produce the blueprint for what's called responsible gambling, where the model is you should have the choice to gamble should you wish to do so, but the industry or the government is then responsible for dealing with the harm that gambling causes. So it's a kind of, you mop up after yourself when you cause those externalities, but that's really the only responsibility you have. If you do that, you're free to make as much money as you want to.
Is there any reliable way of measuring how much gambling there is in the UK and across the world? Do we actually know?
No. We really don't, no. And it's also, like you say, what do you count as gambling? So obviously you couldn't capture all of it because a lot of it is just between individuals, but huge amounts. I remember the very early days speaking to the Gambling Commission. The stats for online gambling are completely, that was completely outside the regulatory capture for many, many years. And then when it suddenly did appear, it was far larger than anyone had realized. So no, there's absolutely no way that you can just pluck a number out of anywhere. So lots of statistics, I think I've said in the book, sort of created and generated about gambling, and then they become repeated and they take on a life of their own, as these things tend to, as you know.
I think an interesting part of the story is the introduction of the betting shop. So what does that introduce, and who are the people who tend to congregate inside it?
Well, making betting in cash legal happened because it was happening anyway, but it was happening illegally on street corners and in factories and at chip shops and stuff like that. And the police and the government became, you know, unsatisfied with having a law that was unenforceable and unpopular. So they legalized betting in cash, which is where betting shops came from. And the people who tended to go there were working class men. And those spaces were, you know, until the 1990s when, you know, gambling, when betting shops started going through some sort of refurbishment, if you like, when money started coming into the industry in larger quantities, they really were just basically bolt holes for people who enjoyed smoking and chatting about racing and very masculine spaces. So when I first started working in betting shops, it was really almost 100% men, older men talking about racing. And then what changed, obviously, was that they brought in gambling machines, fixed odds betting terminals. And as I said to you earlier, you know, there's a big difference between gambling and betting. And betting shops went from being spaces primarily where old men went to bet on horses and dogs to places where, you know, a whole range of different people in London, particularly recent migrants and, you know, and more women than had been the case in the past, came to bet on machines. And as you know, that was a kind of story of huge growth in revenue and income for bookmakers on the basis of FOBTs, huge problems for many people because there are sort of high frequency, they were very high stake form of gambling. And that became a problem, and eventually the government had to listen to gamblers and families of people who had taken their own lives as a result of their addiction to gambling, and to reduce those stakes. But it took a really long time. It took a decade, and it shouldn't have. You know, it was very obvious to most people who'd worked in the industry that there'd been a real change in the way that those spaces operated.
There's a chapter on Gibraltar. What did you learn when you went there?
That I'm glad I don't live in Gibraltar. Gibraltar's a strange place. Have you ever been?
No.
Well, basically, Gibraltar is one of the centres of the online gambling industry, and it's, you know, it's also an important centre for financial services, and you know, it's an offshore hub for many of those industries. And yeah, I went there to find out more about the online industry in particular. And I guess what I discovered, and other people have described it to me in this way as well, is what happens when gambling becomes anonymous. So in betting shops, you have different sorts of interactions. But when you're online, people become, you know, data points. And really, if you're working efficiently as you should for a betting company, you should be maximizing your return on each of those points. And that's what happens in Gibraltar. People are working hard to increase the bottom line, and they do that by making more and more opportunities to gamble, and including particularly increasing the speed of opportunities to gamble and so on. So it was just about how gambling accelerated under the new conditions, the new technological conditions, the new regulatory conditions, and Gibraltar sort of epitomizes that for me. There are other places in the world where that's also taken place, but I think Gibraltar is particularly interesting because of its kind of offshore status, but also because of its sort of liminal status in terms of its national identity and so on. So a lot of things were going on in Gibraltar. And yeah, I think it is a sort of liminal space, and even more so now, when things are very uncertain.
And you promote the view that a gambling addiction is a form of illness. Now, do you think that notion has ever been taken seriously by governments?
I thought it might be at certain points, and I think that the NHS is increasingly recognising that that the state in some ways has to take responsibility for the harms caused by gambling, and I suppose I'm also kind of I sort of have while I think that gambling addiction should be recognised as a condition, if you like, because that's what I've been encouraged to think by people with lived experience, and because the much of the sort of brain imaging data supports that view and so on. I'm also wary of pathologizing people in ways that mean that they aren't still in control of their own recovery. So there are advantages and disadvantages of using that sort of medical model. So I'm kind of I'm still not sure what's the most appropriate way to describe the people's experiences with gambling, and I kind of tend to be led on that by by the many people I speak with who don't want to gamble and didn't want to gamble, but nonetheless got into very difficult situations because they couldn't stop. So yeah, my own point of view is that I don't think we should be. I think that it's very complex to promote gambling at the same time as you acknowledge that there's a relationship between being harmed by gambling and having suicidal thoughts, and attempting suicide, and sometimes sadly succeeding. And I think that that's what people like the Charles and Liz Ritchie have very bravely done through their organisation Gambling with Lives. What they've done is made it impossible for the government to ignore the harm caused by gambling and how it affects families and individuals in a way that I don't think anyone else could have done. I think it really is those powerful stories which say, is it right to be promoting free bets as fun at the same time as that anyone can become addicted to gambling, the most promising, the brightest, everyone. No one is immune, and we don't really know why. And some people will commit suicide as a result of their addiction to gambling. Is those kinds of juxtapositions of, sports sponsorship and a lot of advertising on television. I was looking at the headlines this morning. The Star and the Mirror both have free bets on their front page. How do we make sense of that? I think that organisations like Gambling with Lives, and not just them but others too, have really brought that to the attention of the public and the media in a way that I think before that it was just sort of going under the radar. And I think that medicalization has been useful in some cases, but as an anthropologist, I suppose I would want to preserve some room for a much more socially driven definition of what this problem actually is. To me, the problem is not with the individual. The problem is with the regulation and the way in which gambling is made available to people, normalized, and so on. So it is useful, but it also creates limitations to focus on addiction as a medical issue.
And what drives people to gambling? What did you find in your field work?
I don't think there's obviously there's no single answer to that. Quite a lot of the time gambling runs in families, and so young men in particular who've been taken racing or to the betting shop by their father or grandfather, that tended to be the most common story that I encountered. But more recently, a lot of the women that I worked with come to it from television advertising. And it's just such a sort of a step change in availability, as you can now play on your phone and your tablet and whatever, that whereas women would be traditionally taken to the bingo and certainly would not be taken to the betting shop, now they can access what's called pink gambling easily enough on their iPad or in their phone, and they see those adverts during daytime TV. In most of the cases that I spoke with. But as you know, the other major area is of course through sports sponsorship and the large numbers of adverts during live televised sports, and the commercialization of football. So the market, probably one of the biggest markets that the gambling industry is looking at, is obviously young men who are interested in sport, and encouraging them to kind of take on board the idea that sport is more interesting when you bet on it, and from there moving them on to more lucrative forms of gambling like casino games. So we've seen that during the by 25%, something like that, since lockdown, where obviously opportunities to bet on live sports have been limited.
Okay, I'll finish with this one. Where do you think we should go from here? What practical policy solutions do you think we should be adopting in this country?
I think it's very difficult to say one thing, and I think that it can be unhelpful to focus on one thing. So there's been a recent report by the House of Lords Select Committee, which early on I advised on, and they came up with 66 recommendations. I think those are all interesting points to consider. But personally, I'm a realist, and I started will to actually take a completely different approach to gambling, and to kind of view it more as a potentially an activity that does create harm as well as income. I think otherwise you're sort of rearranging the chairs on the Titanic almost. You're simply sort of fluffing around the edges of what is an intrinsically extractive industry. Personally, I think that there was nothing wrong with the demand rule that we had before the Gambling Act, which was that gambling should be provided to the extent that it meets the demand that exists, but stimulating demand was not allowed. And I think in some ways that would be a far better situation to be in now. But obviously you can't squish that genie back into the bottle easily. So obviously there are some suggestions about trimming around the edges, like not allowing Premier League football people to wear logos on their shirts and stuff. I mean, all of those things may have an impact, and I think that they're all laudable, but until regulation changes, and I can't imagine that happening under the current government, I think it's a matter that gambling needs to be reframed in a way that's much more responsible.
Okay, Rebecca Cassidy, thanks for your time. It was a really great book, and really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Cheers, Ryan. Thank you. I enjoyed it too.